Estamos muy contentos. We're very happy here to have Paul Thagard in Mexico, in particular at the Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas. And I'm going to make a very brief presentation. You already received, not very long, but a list of some of his publications. So I will just mention a couple of things, and then two things related to the talk and of what I think are his most important contributions to philosophy. So Paul Thagard, he's a distinguished professor emeritus of philosophy at the University of Waterloo in Canada, where he founded and directed the cognitive science program. Besides many author books by himself, he was one of the 3 general editors of a series of 16 volumes called The Handbook of Philosophy of Science. And there himself, he was the main editor of the volume entitled Philosophy of Psychology and Cognitive Science. And he has at least, and this is what I can talk about, I don't know much of his other work, his 2 main contributions for philosophy of science, for philosophy in general, of course. The first one has to do with the topic or the notion of inference to the best explanation, and it is his notion of explanatory coherence. And indeed, this idea of him goes back to the 70s, and there's in his initial paper on that topic was called The Best Explanation, Criteria for Theory Choice. This is a paper which is still very much cited and used. I use it for my inductive logic class, and some people even here at the Institute have used it very much, like Amaya in his very nice book. She has used this theory of Paul Thagard for legal reasoning, the kind of things that she does. And the second contribution, which I very much like, has to do with computers. It's, I would say, a methodological contribution. Of course, he's not the pioneer of the use of computers, but he is indeed a pioneer of the use of computers for philosophical inquiry. And one of his first books, if not the first, I don't know, it's called Computational Philosophy of Science, and I will end the presentation just reading out loud 2 very short paragraphs. So Professor Thagard starts his preface of this book as follows. He says, to some ears, computational philosophy of science will sound like the most self-contradictory enterprise in philosophy since business ethics. On the contrary, central philosophical issues concerning the structure and growth of scientific knowledge can be greatly illuminated by drawing on ideas and techniques from the field of artificial intelligence. This book uses PI, a computer program for problem solving and induction, to illustrate the relevance of computational ideas to questions concerning the discovery, evaluation, and application of scientific theories. And then he ends his preface with this other, even shorter paragraph. The book is offered in the hope that it will be read without arbitrary categorization of what is philosophy, artificial intelligence, or psychology, and in the conviction that an understanding of scientific reasoning can only come through interdisciplinary cooperation. So this is my short but hopefully interesting introduction to his talk today. So thank you, Paul Thagard, for being here.
Well, thank you very much. Delighted to be in Mexico. Had a wonderful week of incredibly hospitable people and great food and wonderful conversations. This book is 30 years old, but the paragraph she read actually fit perfectly well with the talk I'm giving today. But I'm taking this in new directions. This is all work done really in the last 6 months, applying my older ideas about explanatory coherence to some new applications that I'm going to start working on. One of them is mental health assessment, and the other is reasoning and epidemiology. These are both very important parts of medicine, and I've been very pleased to see that the ideas extend very nicely to these important areas. So here's an outline of my talk. Since the kind of method I use is not very common in philosophy, I thought I'd start by describing how it works, how computer modeling, back in the very old book, but also in much more recent work, how it works and why it's relevant to making inferences about how philosophy of science works and how epistemology works. But then I'll get into the particular examples that I've been developing recently. One is mental health assessment, the sort of thing that psychiatrists do or psychotherapists do. And then I'll talk about the epidemiological applications that I've gone into very recently. But then I'll talk about other ways in which you can use ideas from cognitive science and from computer modeling to help understand other aspects of medical inference, including multimodal inference, which means inference using visual representations and other kinds of non-verbal representations. How you can also use the kinds of ideas from cognitive science to understand how discoveries come about, and also how people often make errors when they're looking at medical matters. And if there's time, I'll talk a little bit about social mechanisms as well. So let's start with why I think cognitive science, which is the interdisciplinary field that includes psychology and neuroscience and computer modeling and linguistics, has a lot to bring to the philosophy of science. The basic idea for this really originates with Thomas Kuhn. Now, he's more often thought of bringing sociological factors in, but if you look at the structure of scientific revolutions, it actually has quite a bit of psychology in it. It was influenced by the Gestalt psychologists, a powerful school of psychology coming out of Germany. And in fact, the idea of paradigm shift, which is famous, it's in the dictionaries even, comes from the idea of a Gestalt switch, which were the Gestalt psychologists were talking about. So he uses Gestalt psychology ideas. And he also, remember this book was written in 1962 when the field of cognitive science was just getting started, but he takes some ideas from Jerome Bruner about the way people can notice different kinds of conceptual anomalies. So he probably deserves to be thought of as the person who started this, even though it's not often recognized. But the field of the cognitive science of science with philosophical applications really got going in the 1980s because Lindy Darden, Ron Geary, Nancy Nersessian, and I independently realized that there are lots of tools to be taken from the cognitive sciences that could help to understand the structure and growth of scientific knowledge. These tools could be, I think, much richer than the ones that philosophers of science had traditionally used, either vague verbal ideas or some of the logical ideas that were employed by the logical positivists. Cognitive science suggested lots of much richer ways of thinking about how scientists operate. By looking at what goes on in scientists' minds. Obviously, every scientist who ever lives has a mind and has a brain, and you can go a lot by trying to figure out how their brains work and how it works. So we try to give now explanations of how science works by looking at the mental operations that they use when they're engaged in making discoveries, forming hypotheses, evaluating competing hypotheses. These can all be thought of as cognitive operations operating in their mind. Well, what kind of explanations do you give? In recent years in philosophy of science, one of the most fertile notions has been the idea of explanation as involving mechanisms. You can't really use the hypothetical deductive models very well because, unlike in physics, there aren't general mathematical laws of thought, but there are mechanisms, both mental mechanisms where people work with mental representations and processes, and also neural mechanisms where you're looking at the neurons operating with neural processes. All of these are mechanistic. Well, what's a mechanism? A mechanism is just a set of parts that are connected with each other and interact with each other in order to produce regular changes. So let me give you a really simple example, would be a bicycle. So a bicycle's got pedals, it's got a chain, it's got wheels, and what you do is you take these parts, and they're all connected together in your bike, but they interact with each other. So you start the pedals going, that turns the chain, that turns the wheel, and it moves you down the street. So that's a very simple mechanism. But mental mechanisms involving concepts and beliefs and emotions are parts of the mental processes. And when you look at the brain, the parts are the neurons, and they're connected by synapses, and the changes are the result of the interactions of neurons where they excite or inhibit each other. So there's loads of ways of taking these ideas about explanations in matter of mechanisms as applying it to scientific thinking. How does a scientist work in terms of the mechanisms of their mind, which I think are understandable in terms of the mechanisms of their brain. But how does computer modeling get into this? Well, here's a diagram that I used in my Cognitive Science of Science book from 2012 that I think captures the mechanisms, the method that's being used. Still very rare in philosophy, but extremely common in cognitive science and in theoretical neuroscience. So you can have some experimental results, or in the case of philosophy of science, these can be case studies. So you look and see what Darwin did, or what Lavoisier did, or what Newton did, or what modern quantum theory is doing. So you've got some things you want to explain. Well, how do you explain them? Well, I suggest that the kind of explanation should not just be a story. There are lots of fields like history, and people primarily use narrative explanations. Instead, you want a mechanistic explanation. So you postulate what you think are the mechanisms going on in their minds and their brains that will explain what the scientists are doing, how they're coming up with discoveries, how they're preferring their theories over others. But then how do you know it's a good mechanism? It's not, the relation between experimental results and hypothetical mechanisms can be kind of loose. It's not going to be a simple deductive one that you might find in a highly mathematical field like physics. Well, what you can do is you can try to describe the mechanisms by some kind of mathematics that can enable you to produce the computer models. You build the computer program and then you can run the computer program and see what happens. You can see what the results of the simulations are. But now you've got the basis for thinking, not that your mechanisms that you're attributing to the scientists are definitely right, but that they could be approximately right, because you can compare the simulation results with the experimental results. You can see whether your computer program is behaving the way that people are. If it does, well, then at least you've got some initial inductive evidence that you're on the right track, that the mechanisms that you're postulating of going on in the scientist's mind might be the ones that they're actually performing. But of course, this is not a one-shot thing. When you do the simulation results, sometimes it doesn't work very well. You might think that the computer will do everything you want it to. No, because you've implemented the mechanisms in a fairly complicated model. There's lots of interactions in it. And sometimes it doesn't behave the way you want. It's not behaving like the scientist or like experimental subjects, at which point you might think, oh, well, we better do new experiments, get new results, and come up with new mechanisms. So think of this as an ongoing process, not one thing. So this is what I think is a powerful methodology, widely used in cognitive science, and quite fertile also in the philosophy of science. But today, I'm going to talk about a particular application of it to medical inference. And here, I'm interested in many different kinds of medical inference. I'm just going to mention a couple of them, but I'm going to go into detail on the main one. So, physician diagnosis. All of you go to the doctor sometimes, and you tell the doctor what your problem is. How does the doctor come up with a diagnosis, figure out what's wrong with you? So last year, I had a sore knee, went to my doctor and said, oh, it's really annoying. My knee hurts whenever I exercise, and so I can't exercise very much. And so she asked me a few questions, and she said, oh, it looks like you've got a patellar femoral problem, and what you need to do is do exercises to keep your kneecap from sliding around, and then it'll be fine. And once I found the right exercises, she was right. But what she did there was a diagnosis. She figured out that it was a kneecap problem that was causing my pain. Same thing happens, you go to the doctor with a cough. Well, it can't be a simple deductive inference because there are lots of things that coughs can be a symptom of. It could be a cold, it could be a flu, it could be that you have, you have lung cancer, it could be, what's the disease that lots of smokers get, not as bad as lung cancer, breathing problems?
COPD.
COPD, yeah. And there's something, anyway, I forget the word. But anyway, there's at least half a dozen possible diagnoses that the doctor might entertain. And this is, of course, just like scientific reasoning. The evidence is you've got a cough, but what the doctor does is collect more evidence and then come up with the best hypothesis. So physician diagnosis is a matter of coming up with the best explanation. It's a matter of explaining your symptoms by putting it all together. And there have been some work in artificial intelligence modeling physician diagnosis as this kind of abductive inference. We use the term that Peirce applied to this. This is what Peirce called abductive inference. It's generating hypotheses to explain things. Okay, but this has been fairly well researched, so I won't talk about it. I'm going to talk a lot about something about which almost nothing's been written, namely mental health assessment. This is what happens when you go to a psychiatrist or a psychotherapist, and here you're dealing with mental health problems. The most common are things like depression and anxiety, and the mental health professional wants to help you. There's also important kinds of causal inference in epidemiology. Epidemiology is where you do very much broader general population studies to try to determine the causes of disease. One famous example is smoking. So people began to suspect in the 1950s that smoking causes cancer. But how can you show that smoking causes cancer? That's what the field of epidemiology is set out to do. Multimodal inference, as I already mentioned, is cases where you are doing this, but not as verbal reasoning, where you're using pictures, such as X-rays, as being part of the process. Another application that I've gotten really interested in, but I haven't really developed this in any detail, is evidence-based medicine. In evidence-based medicine, you try to use different kinds of studies, especially randomized clinical trials, to try to figure out whether treatments are actually effective. This isn't always understood as a kind of causal reasoning, but I think it is, and well, I'll develop that in later work. So I've got one model that applies to all of these cases, explanatory coherence. And this comes from philosophy. This originally came from the work of Wilfrid Sellars back in the 60s. It was developed in more detail in the 1970s by Gilbert Harman. He's the one who first used the term inference to the best explanation. So the idea is you've got lots of puzzling things happen, you've got various hypotheses, and you want to come up with the best explanation. But it can be really complicated because you can have lots of evidence, you can have lots of different alternative hypotheses, and then you can have higher level hypotheses that explain your hypotheses, your medical ones. So for example, if you go to a doctor with a cough, the hypothesis might be that you've got a cold, but if you tell the doctor in addition that you're a heavy smoker, then he or she is going to have different kinds of hypotheses that will make sense, because smoking will cause lung cancer, which will cause your cough. And so you get these hierarchies of hypotheses. So how are you going to make inference to the best explanation that will do this? Well, I was familiar with Sellars and Harman's work, and then had the great fortune in, I guess, about 1987 to realize that explanatory coherence could be computed by a kind of neural network. I mean, nowadays, neural networks are all over the place. If you use Facebook or Google or Apple, your computer's got neural networks built into them because they're marvelous for pattern recognition. But these were early days of neural networks, but I figured that a fairly standard kind of neural network could do the philosophical task of computing explanatory coherence. And I'll describe today how that works. Okay, let's start with a concrete example, mental health assessment. So mental health professionals include a lot of different people. They can be psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, psychotherapists, family physicians, psychiatric nurses, but the assessment's the same in all cases. Somebody goes to a mental health professional and says, I've got like this horrible problem. I can't even get out of bed in the morning. That would be a symptom of depression. But of course, there could be other problems that they have. And what the mental health professional has to do is to try to come up with an assessment, which is essentially a diagnosis. So that could then have an idea of how to treat you and make your life better. What are the problems? The most common tend to be depression, anxiety, stress, various social problems. It could be psychosis, where you're completely lost touch with reality. Where the psychiatrist or other mental health professional has to try to figure out what's wrong with you. So the goal is practical. It's got to be to plan a treatment, but you're going to do a lot better in planning a treatment if you know actually what the problem is, if you identify the mental problem that the person has. So a mental health professional, really in the very first meeting, is trying to make this kind of assessment. What's wrong with this person that made them want to go for mental health care, and how can I help them? Okay, so almost everything I know about psychotherapy comes from my co-author on this project. I guess a copy of our paper is Lorette Laroque. She's a very experienced psychotherapist in Guelph, Ontario, about 40 minutes from Waterloo, where I live. And I've been seeing her for 2 years, but not professionally, actually socially. And I've had dozens of collaborators over the years. I've got many psychologists, a few philosophers, a few computer scientists. But this is the only collaboration I've ever had that originated on Match.com. So the way this project originated is a year ago, I was invited to give a talk at a conference in Toronto at the University of Toronto Medical School on clinical judgment, because they were familiar with the work I'd done back in the 90s on applying computational ideas to understand the acceptance of the bacterial theory of ulcers. But of course, I couldn't talk about stuff from the 1990s. So I thought, well, what am I going to do that's new, that's about clinical judgment? And of course, for the preceding year, I've been talking to Lorette about her work. She obviously doesn't give me personal details, but she talks about the kinds of problems she deals with every week. And she's been doing this for decades. She's very experienced, very successful. And so I suddenly realized that what she did with all her new clients, typically 1 or 2 a week, was a really interesting, complicated kind of inference that I think fit well with the explanatory coherence model. So here are some questions that I was able to talk about with Brad. How do psychotherapists and other professionals identify problems? That is, how are they figuring out what's wrong with the people? Usually, people don't go to psychotherapists for fun. They've got something that's really, really bothering them. So what is the problem? Here's an interesting logical question. Are the thought processes of these mental health professionals the same as what physicians do, medical doctors? Is she using the same kind of thinking as my doctor when she figures out what's wrong with my knee or if I've got a cough? What are the cognitive processes? Really interesting question in cognitive science that people are already going on. But here you get this interesting question of how do you make the connection between assessment and treatment? In epistemology, this goes by this really funny name called pragmatic encroachment. So in epistemology, people look at various kinds of inferences, and some people have said, oh, there's practical relevance. And they use the word encroachment, which suggests that somehow there's some kind of interfering with the good, solid epistemology if you allow personal goals to get involved. But if you're a mental health professional, if you're a doctor, if you're not concerned with making people better, you're just incompetent. And so the question of what problem somebody has and how can you help them, these are completely connected. Well, how can that work? And finally, this comes out of cognitive psychology. I guess it also comes out of the field of critical thinking and informal logic, is what kind of errors do they make? Because nobody's infallible. Psychiatrists, just like doctors, just like psychotherapists, just like everybody, makes errors sometimes. And so if you're going to have a good account of how people think, you should have an account of when it goes wrong as well as when it goes right. So these are, I thought, were great questions to ask. And Lorette and I have worked out answers to a lot of them. Well, but now you might think, if you're familiar at all with psychiatry or clinical psychology, you might think, oh, this isn't a tough problem. Here's the Bible of psychiatry. It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. And just sort of looking at it superficially suggests, oh, this is easy. This isn't complicated inference. We don't need to have inference to the best explanation. We don't have to have explanatory coherence. We don't have neural networks. We'll just match that. So the basic idea here is you should just be able to use the list of disorders here, and there are hundreds of them, and each one comes with a list of symptoms. And so you got a list of symptoms, and of course you're noticing what symptoms people have, they're describing what their problems are, and it should just be a question of matching. So the patient has a disorder that best matches the list. So it's just pattern recognition. A computer could do this. Wouldn't that be easy? Well, there probably are some mental health professionals who do that, but they're not good ones. Why? Well, first I should give you an example. So probably the most common mental disorder is depression. This is the single largest source of disability in the world today in work. Lots of people can't work because they're simply too depressed. So how would you diagnose depression based on the DSM? Well, it looks pretty simple because they list 9 different symptoms. And they simply say, well, if you've got 5 of the 9, and as long as it includes at least one of the first 2. So the first 2 are most important. You've got to have at least one of these. Depressed mood most of the day. That just means you're sad most of the day. Markedly diminished interest or pleasure.
old activities that you used to like cooking, used to like philosophy, but you don't anymore. Okay, so that's and then you can see all these other ones. I don't have to go through them. People have lost or gained a lot of weight, but click it off, 5 out of 9, bingo! We got the inference, you've got depression, and then we can just go and give you cognitive behavioral therapy, which actually works quite a lot of the time. In some places like England, it's actually done on the computer. You don't even have to see a psychotherapist, and then you're all better. Well, okay. Well, what's wrong with this? I think there are at least 4, probably 5 reasons why, even though this is a useful tool, it's only practically useful because sometimes you have to justify diagnoses to insurance companies and things like that. I think there are 5 reasons why this isn't a good picture of the kind of inference that's being done by mental health professionals. Like Lorette says, she doesn't use DSM. She wants to develop her own account of what's going on with people. And she's unusual because her PhD is actually in cognitive science. She's thoroughly trained in clinical methods as well. But she did her PhD with Keith Oatley, who's one of the leader researchers on emotions. So she's got this much deeper knowledge of emotions than clinical psychologists have. So she uses that, and she also uses extensive training she had in a number of methods, including a cognitive behavioral therapy, but also psychodynamic therapy. And basically, she will select what seems to be useful for the particular patient. So she says she doesn't use DSM, and she says that she considers quite a few of her clients come to her as what they describe themselves as CBT refugees, because they took cognitive behavioral therapy and it just didn't help them. Often because the problems that they have are much deeper than cognitive behavioral therapy can work with. So what's wrong with it? Well, it encourages you to have a mere counting rather than assessment of importance. So different symptoms could be very important for different sort of purposes. It doesn't look at, okay, so that's getting ahead of myself. It also, the DSM is sort of amazing in taking these hundreds of disorders and giving symptoms for each of them, but quite often disorders aren't disjoint from each other. There's quite often that people have a number of problems, like say depression and anxiety, and that have to be worked with together. And so the overlaps and the combinations aren't handled by that very well. One of the biggest things that lots of philosophers and lots of psychiatrists have criticized the DSM for is it's based on an incredibly naive way of doing classification. It's kind of like the way medicine was done before the germ theory of disease came along in the middle of the century. It was all symptom-based because they basically didn't know the causes of any disease. Well, they had causal theories about imbalances in the 4 humors, but basically you were classified as a disease based on symptoms. So a disease at the time was fever. Fever was a disease. Well, nowadays, in medicine, you think of fever as a symptom of disease and you look for underpinnings. So now we've got good causal theories in lots of areas of medicine for infectious diseases, for nutritional diseases, for autoimmune diseases. And in all these other areas of medicine, you can classify diseases based on what causes the disease, not just by collecting the symptoms. And so this is a really embarrassing aspect of psychiatry. But of course, psychiatrists know about this. When they moved from DSM-4 to DSM-5, their ambition was to try to make it more causally based. But the problem is we don't have those causal theories enough these days. We don't know what some of the causes are, but it's not nearly at the level of the understanding of infectious diseases. So the attempts are underway to try to change this. The National Institute for Mental Health says they won't fund any research based on DSM because they see this is just symptom counting. Instead, they use what they call research domain criteria. And the research domain criteria try to get at causal theories of mental illness, much of it tied in with advances in neuroscience to use to give event. But this is going to take years for that to develop. But it shows that the DSM is at best a stopgap for doing diagnosis. But one of the biggest problems, like this is probably one of Lorette's biggest worries, is that the identification of symptoms provides minimal ideas about how you can do a deeper kind of therapy. So cognitive behavioral therapy has helped lots of people, but it's good for not really deep problems. But if you want to get at cases, Lorette deals with a lot of cases of people who've had sexual abuse or other kinds of trauma, really bad family upbringings. If you want to get at helping people to overcome their problems, you need to have a much better causal understanding of where it came from. So how do you do that? So these are 4 reasons. I actually just discovered another reason for doing this. because I decided I should actually read the DSM, which I've never done before. Anyway, so I went through the whole thing, and it's really interesting that after the sets of symptoms, they have a criterion that I hadn't noticed before, just looking at parts of the things. They say, oh, if you want to decide that someone has, say, depressive disorder, you have to say, you also take into account, and there's no better explanation of their symptoms. And so in a way they kind of smuggle in inference is the best explanation afterwards to indicate that it's not even from the point of DSM that people are doing simple pattern recognition or symptom count. So what you want is to have an understanding of causal patterns. And so I think any good mental health professional is going to want to know something about the background of the people. What kinds of stress are they under? It could be economic stresses because of unemployment, occupational stresses such as a mean, nasty boss, or family problems. Of course, lots of the problems that people go to psychotherapy for are because of problems in their marriages or with in-laws or with their children. Educational problems. Everyone here knows that education can be stressful. So if you've got final exams or your thesis is now 10 years overdue, then you've definitely got things to worry about. Okay, so you want to know the background stress as part of a causal pattern. But there also could be triggers. Someone can have a whole bunch of these stressors, but then something happens. It could be a bad interaction with a thesis supervisor or a fight with your romantic interest. And so that could be a trigger. But I mean, these are just as important to get a causal understanding of mental health problems as the symptoms that people have, which is the current manifestations of the problems. So what you want is a causal model that gives you some idea of how the stressors plus the triggers will lead to the symptoms. Once you have this, then you got a basis of treatment, of intervening causally. In the same way that if you know somebody has a bacterial infection, you can give them an antibiotic to interfere with that causal mechanism and help them get better. Well, I think that what a good psychotherapist is doing is similarly intervening causally, changing people's beliefs, changing people's emotions, and using that as part of a way of changing their mental state. So instead of being horribly miserable, they feel a lot better. Okay, so how do we understand that? Well, here's an example of it, of a causal model. It's in the paper, I think. So you can have different ideas about how people are depressed or anxious, but you want to have an account of how that came about. In a particular case, someone's problems may go way back to their childhood because of an abusive father, more immediately because of general work stress, or maybe an insulting boss. So the arrows here are causality. And so that's how you get depression, which is how you get people feeling sad all the time, or being unable to sleep, or gaining weight because they're eating all the time. Actually, I think it's in German. I can't remember the word. There's a German word that translates something as grief bacon, and basically it's the overeating. It's the weight that you gain as a result of being in a bad relationship. Okay, so that's a causal model built into the language. Or anxiety could be a result of spouse conflicts, and that could also explain weight gain and no sleep. So what you need to do is to build this kind of causal model. But now, if this is right, we've got a really interesting problem about inference. And it's a philosophical problem, it's a practical problem, which is how, given these complex causal networks, do you infer that somebody has depression or anxiety or both? What kind of inference is involved? And there are two ways you can do this, given current computational technology. One is Bayesian, which I won't talk about unless you ask me, and the other is explanatory coherence. So let me explain how this works. The most recent discussion I've got in book form is the 2012 book, The Cognitive Science of Science. But when I started reading literature, I didn't want to, of course, just rely on Lorette, because that's one example of a mental health professional. I started reading lots of books on psychiatric assessment and the first interview. So Morrison wrote a book called The First Interview, and it sounds just like inference is the best explanation. The best diagnosis, most satisfactory, explains the data, signs, and symptoms of illness. So I hope you can see I've already answered one of the questions I gave at the beginning. If this is true, and this is what psychiatrists tend to think and what Lorette thinks, it is the same as medical diagnosis. It's the same kind of reasoning that went on when my doctor diagnosed my knee problem. Okay, so that goes. So it's inference is the best explanation, to use the philosophical term, but it involves layers of causes. Layers of causes, one of the areas where this is most familiar with is in detective novels. So if you've got a detective novel where you've got a crime committed, and you might consider different people who were the criminal, but one of the things that every detective looks for is the motive. So the motive is going to be the cause of the action, which is going to explain the different pieces of evidence you've got. So you've got layers of causes and alternate explanations, and all this is efficiently computed by a neural network account of maximizing explanatory coherence that I've written way too many papers about. All right, so how does it work? Well, now you have to actually start thinking of inference in a different way from the way philosophers usually think. So philosophers learn about inference from logic, from formal logic. It's basically deductive, and you've got your principles of deduction and rules like modus ponens, and one step at a time, you do something that's like a mathematical proof. Well, that doesn't apply very well in these cases. It's not one step at a time. It's much more holistic. You have to figure out about how all the hypotheses work together, how all the pieces of evidence work together. This ideas about coherence go back to Hegel and the 19th century idealists, but that was all vague and funny. This takes old ideas about inference being holistic and making it quite precise. The key idea to describe this kind of inference is parallel constraint satisfaction. You've got a bunch of different constraints because you've got the hypotheses that explain evidence. You've got negative constraints because the hypotheses have to compete with each other to be the best explanation. So what you have to do is you take this whole pile of ideas, it could be, in some cases, hundreds of different beliefs, and figure out how they can fit together in the most sensible way. Well, not all of the ideas are to be treated the same. I have what I call a principle of data priority that says that some things you get from observation and evidence get some priority. That doesn't mean they're guaranteed to be true. It's not like foundationalist epistemology or positivist philosophy of science where you've got these evidence things that are guaranteed to be true and you build everything out from that. Because the evidence is often wrong. It can be wrong in science because your experiments aren't very good. It can be wrong in psychotherapy because people lie to you. They don't always tell you what's going on. I've heard that for both doctors and mental health professionals, they have a rule of thumb. They ask people, well, how much do you drink? Because that's obviously medically relevant. And what they usually do, they hear what people say and then they double it. Okay, so you don't take the evidence at face value, but it's something that goes into it. And even figuring out whether a patient is lying or not could be a question of, I guess another thing besides drinking that people lie about is sexual activity. Okay, so these are some of the constraints that go in. The positive constraints come about because the hypotheses explain the evidence. So that if their hypothesis that someone has the flu explains the cough, then the hypothesis and a piece of evidence fit together, they cohere. If they got different hypotheses that are incompatible, then they're incoherent with each other. But this isn't just logical incoherence. And so there's logical incoherence between saying, well, someone's got the flu and someone doesn't have the flu. That can't be true. There's a logical contradiction. But it's at least possible that they have both the flu and a cold. Maybe they got a couple of viruses at once. Sometimes you have multiple diseases working together. So in that case, the incoherence is not going to be just logical contradiction. Logical contradiction doesn't take you far in computing coherence. You need to have these ideas of competing hypotheses. And now, what the computer program Echo that I wrote a long time ago does, it maximizes coherence by figuring out what hypotheses to accept and which ones to reject. Quite a simple algorithm, but actually quite powerful. Okay, so let's see how this works with mental health. So this, I simulated a couple of examples, one from Laurette's practice, but also one that I took from a psychiatric textbook. This is the one from the textbook. So here you've got a patient or client comes in and says to the psychiatrist, I'm depressed all the time, and the patient starts crying during the interview. I've got no energy, I'm unable to concentrate. And you might think, oh, deductively, almost, oh, that means that the patient is depressed, but it's not deductive. It's not pattern matching because it has to be part of the overall causal model, considering other hypotheses. So the psychiatrist in this case will ask different kinds of questions, because it might not be that the appropriate diagnosis is depression. It might be bipolar disorder, also known as manic depression. So you have to ask, well, do you have any bizarre energy at times? Do you have these manic experiences? If that case, that would be bipolar disorder. But in this case, it wasn't. So these solid lines here indicate the coherence links. They indicate what fits with what. Cases where you've got an explanation, depression would explain what cries, so that's a fit. But then you've got the alternative hypotheses, such as bipolar disorder, which would be not a fit. So the dots here indicate incompatibility. Another thing you might consider for the lack of concentration would be that the patient is psychotic. Because if you're having hallucinations all the time, that can keep you from concentrated. So the psychiatrist asks, do you have hallucinations? Do they see things that aren't there? And in this case, no, there weren't hallucinations, so they're not psychotic. So that supports the hypothesis of depression. So what we do in the paper that's floating around is describe how modeling this as coherence and showing that the computer program comes up with the same result as the patient, you get a pretty good account of what's going on in the minds of the mental health professional who's figuring out people's problems are. So that's how we think mental health assessment works. It fits very nicely with this model of explanatory coherence that's been applied to a large number of examples in law, large number of examples in science, some of the most important episodes in the history of science. So explained this way. And it turns out quite nicely to apply also to mental health assessment. Okay, let's do another application now to epidemiology. Here I left out as well. You might think you plan your career, but no, sometimes you just get lucky. This was just luck. I was at a conference again last summer in Toronto. It was the Philosophy of Medicine Roundtable, which is a new relatively new organization that does wonderful things to have regular meetings and email lists. Philosophy of medicine is a really new field. When I started doing medical examples in the 90s, I wasn't thinking I was doing philosophy of medicine. I just stumbled onto a really interesting case study in development of medicine of the bacterial theory of ulcers. But philosophy of medicine didn't exist. Now it's actually quite a nicely organized field. There's now new textbooks and anthologies coming out. That's a wonderful growth industry. But because I've done this older work, sometimes people seek me out. And in this case, I've been getting emails for a while from a guy at Tufts University in Boston who's an epidemiologist. And he told me I should be applying my models to epidemiology. And I basically just ignored him because I was writing 3 books, didn't have time for it. But at this conference, I met Olaf Dahlman. And he had a paper that he's just published in the American Journal of Epidemiology, where he says that if you want to understand the kind of reasoning done by epidemiology, you should look to philosophical work on explanatory coherence, and maybe Thagard's echo model would apply to it. Okay, well, I was intrigued, but didn't have time. But then I had a break between the reviews of my books, and I met him at this conference. He was a really nice guy. And so I said, well, if I was going to model epidemiology, what example should I do? And he said, the Zika virus, because there was a paper published just last year in a major medical journal and making the case that the Zika virus is the cause of the birth defects. So if you imagine, this is just fairly recent, just a few years ago, that suddenly in Brazil and other places, babies were being born with shrunken brains, microcephaly. Did this hit Mexico at all? Okay. Yeah. Not much? Yeah. Okay. So, but there's lots of other places besides Brazil where once the Zika virus gets in, and suddenly you have babies being born with severe brain defects. But of course, that could just be an accident. I mean, that could just be the old philosophical term post hoc ergo propter hoc. One thing happens there for another, just because the Zika virus showed up in Brazil and suddenly there could be completely different causes. So you need to have a way of coming up with a conclusion that is in fact the cause of people's problems. And there was this beautiful paper that I read right away that laid out the logic of the inference. And so the question was, did that fit, as Olaf Dahlman conjectured, with my explanatory coherence model. So when I had a break between while I was waiting for reviews to come back, I just really took a morning to go through the paper in detail and develop the model. So this indicates what it looks like. So the crucial hypothesis here is that the Zika virus causes the defects, and you get evidence for it, or support for it, coming from two directions. Some of it, actually three directions. Some of it's come from what it explains. So that microcephaly, shrunken brains, was rare before the Zika virus showed up in Brazil. And in Brazil, once people are infected, once women are infected, it's more likely that their children are going to end up with shrunken brains. And a similar study was done in Polynesia, which found the same sort of thing. But this is still kind of circumstantial evidence. You'd be silly to infer causality just from that. That still could be correlation. But they started to look at getting a mechanistic understanding of how the Zika virus actually produces the defects. And there was some highly relevant evidence that came in. We were able to show that the Zika virus is neurotropic. That is, that the Zika virus isn't just going for the lungs like some viruses do, it's actually going to the brain. It's going to infect the neurons. And they've looked at ways in which the Zika virus, once it's in cells, can produce abnormal cells. So the virus is actually messing up the developments in, I think it's stem cells. But still, that's not enough. You have to consider other causes, but in this case, it actually wasn't that hard because there weren't other ideas of what the causes might be, but you have to at least consider there could be another cause. And one thing that would maybe suggest there might be another cause is they weren't able to produce animal models. That is, ideally, you want to be able to take animals like mice, inject them with Zika virus, and see if the brains are, but they didn't have that. So maybe there's some other cause. But also, what was operating, and the paper makes it very clear, was a kind of analogy. Because if you think of what goes on with rubella, which is a kind of measles, when people get infected from that, that can cause birth defects. So part of the reasoning went on here. It's not just accounting for the evidence, it's not just saying where it comes from, it's also reasoning by analogy. And this fits perfectly well with the most famous idea of how causal reasoning works in epidemiology, produced by a British epidemiologist named Bradford Hill. In the 50s, he was one of the first people doing studies to suggest that smoking causes cancer. And then he stepped back in the 60s and wrote a paper giving what he called his viewpoints, which were 9 criteria for evaluating causality. And as recent as just 3 years ago, an epidemiologist published a paper saying, nobody knows what this is going on. It doesn't fit with any model that's available of inductive reasoning. It's not Humean, it's not Baconian induction. How we can't understand this. But then Olaf Daumann just published this paper saying it's explanatory coherence. And now Olaf Daumann and I and another philosopher named Ted Poston have got a paper where we model not only the Zika virus, but also 2 other really interesting cases in epidemiology. One is the classic case that smoking causes cancer. So we look back at some of the classic papers from the 60s that argue that smoking causes cancer, and you had to make the case that the evidence is really pretty weak because only a small proportion of people who smoke get cancer, and there are people who get cancer who don't smoke. But you look at the statistics and you consider alternative hypotheses. Alternative hypotheses that this is just chance, or there's something else going on, such as the genetics of the individuals. The cigarette industry loved that alternative hypothesis, saying, oh, some people are just getting cancer because they got bad genes. It's not our cigarettes that's causing it. But what needed to be done very carefully was to make the causal case that smoking causes cancer. The other case that we've studied in this, Ted Poston recognized this one, is the classic case of John Swan's work that cholera is caused by contagion. Unfortunately, the heavy lifting had been done for this already by a philosopher of science named Dana Tuladzwecki. She published a paper just a few years ago where she gave an account of what John Snow was doing as showing the explanatory power of his account. So I was able, in the course of about an hour, to crank through her paper, turn that into an analysis very much like this. And so we got 3 cases in that paper, which is now under review. But we did something else in that paper, which I think is kind of cool. Because Bradford Hill had these 9 criteria that he gave for making causal judgments in epidemiology. And what we showed is that all his criteria fit perfectly inside the explanatory coherence framework. And all the things he listed. Some of them were statistical things where you find correlations, but he also talked about coherence, actually. He also said how you got to make sure your hypothesis is coherent with the rest of knowledge. It's got to make biological sense. And what he meant by biological sense, under my interpretation, is you got to understand the mechanisms. So you not only know what the disease is, you want to know the mechanisms behind that. And of course, explanatory coherence does that beautifully, because you get hypotheses that explain hypotheses that explain the data. So both in the general terms of accounting for the Bradford-Hill criteria and in particular cases of modeling 3 really important cases of epidemiological inference, I think we've got a really good account of that. We'll see what the reviewers say. Have you ever seen, this is off topic, have you ever seen the wonderful parody called The Third Reviewer? Okay, somebody's seen it. There was a movie made about the fall of Hitler, where Hitler has an absolute rant and rage because his soldiers are being defeated. And it's got this wonderful rant, and of course it's all in German, which makes it even angrier. So there's a video you could probably find online called The Third Reviewer, where what they do is they take Hitler's rant in German and they put it with English subtitles. And what he's ranting about is how the third reviewer has screwed his article. Okay, so maybe we'll get 3 good reviewers. You never get 3 good reviewers, but I hope we won't get that nasty third reviewer who's comparable to the defeated Stalingrad. All right, so how am I doing for time? Oh, okay, so this is another example. This is the cholera example, and it's complicated because he cites a whole bunch of different kinds of evidence. He's got his hypothesis that communication, which is his word for contagion or infection, causes cholera, and he thinks he's got an underlying causal explanation of it that's spread by evacuations, which is his polite word for excrement. But he does something that wasn't in the Zika simulation, a systematic comparison with an alternative hypothesis. Because the alternative to contagion ideas at the time was miasma. Miasma just means bad air. And that was probably the dominant view, that bad air causes cholera. And there was a causal model. Matter decays and people inhale it in. So if you live in a swampy area, that will cause your cholera. And that can explain something, but it also makes a bad prediction. It makes a bad prediction that the medical men, they're all men, I guess, at the time, would get more cholera. But it turns out medical men actually get less cholera, which the communication theory can explain. Because the medical men are more careful about hygiene, about washing their hands and things like that. So he's got this, I'll go through all of this incredibly coherent account that explains, there's several things. It explains all the different kinds of evidence that, for example, the cholera first appears at seaports. That's communication, and it competes with the alternative, and it has an explanation of why it happens. I don't think he has analogies there, but maybe I just didn't go deep enough into the case. But all of the things that he talks about and all of the things that Bradford Hill talk about can all be handled by explanatory coherence. Okay, so how am I doing for time? When do you want to break? You said you break usually at 1:10?
Later, so you might finish in 9 minutes?
I'll finish in 9
Would that
minutes.
be okay?
Yeah, okay. So let me just mention a couple of other things. So that's the basic part of the talk. I want to claim that medical diagnosis and mental health assessment and epidemiology can all be understood as a complicated kind of causal inference that explanatory coherence fits beautifully. And part of the evidence for the fit, of course, is being able to run the computer program and getting the appropriate result. But that's not all there is to medical inference. One thing I've been really interested in recent years is multimodal inference. Because in my earlier models, I was assuming, as logicians tend to do, that you're doing an inference using verbal representations. But people do lots of inferences with pictures or with sounds. And so often the medical inference is going to be nonverbal. So an X-ray, for example, a radiologist or a good doctor will look at a joint and be able to see right away what's wrong with it. So you don't have to turn everything into words. So I asked Lorette if there were nonverbal characteristics of her practice when people come to her with these problems. She said, of course, visual. So if someone is won't look at her, got their eyes downcast, well, that's going to be highly relevant in coming up with a diagnosis. Or, of course, if they're crying, as I already mentioned, if they're auditory, if they're speaking just with a tiny whisper, you can't even hear them, that's another non-verbal piece of evidence to take into it. If this is sort of embarrassing, if they smell bad, they haven't been showering for months, well, that's an olfactory piece of evidence. And of course, tactile things, if sometimes give an encouraging touch from a therapist, and they recoil in horror, well, that can be evidence as well. So both medical inference and mental health inference is highly multimodal. Now, but this is actually completely compatible with echo, because the hypotheses, and I don't call them propositions anymore, I call them elements. These could be visual representations, these could be auditory, olfactory, any of these. So it's compatible with echo. I just have never done an example like that because it's just easier to do the verbal ones. But there's a good way of thinking about multimodal inference that's now become available using a new idea about the theory of the mind developed by my colleague Chris Elias-Smith. It's called the semantic pointer architecture. I don't have time to tell you about that today, but this is an idea of how the brain works that can handle imagery quite beautifully. I show this in the book I got coming out in the fall called Brain Mind. It's part of a general package of 3 books. So anyway, multimodal inference is not something I built a computer model of, but it's completely consistent with the semantic pointer idea, of which there are computer models. So this should be possible to bring this into consideration. Another thing that can be brought into consideration involves discovery. So you want to explain how scientists come up with discoveries or how new theories of mental illness work. A lot of the times, discoveries aren't just about new concepts or hypotheses in your interests, or new instruments, they're new methods. Procedural discovery is where you come up with a whole new way of doing things, like statistical inference or computer modeling or formal logic. These are all new methods. And in Brain Mind, I show how this can apply to the case of CRISPR-Cas9. This is one of the biggest developments in recent medicine because it's a new way of doing genetic manipulation, much more precise because biologists came across a way of very precisely splicing genes up and inserting and removing genetic material. This hasn't become medically useful yet, but there are a lot of different clinical trials underway right now. And many people think this is going to be a real groundbreaking part of medicine in helping people with genetic diseases, of which there's lots. But for that to happen, there had to be a new procedure, this new method of gene splicing, thinking about CRISPR. And I give an account of how this came about as a new procedure, partly by visual representations, because in biology, you're always using diagrams to try to indicate how things work in other relations. A final application of medical inference, where I think the computational cognitive way of doing this is really useful, is to explaining why people's are sometimes really bad in their medical inferences. So in Mind Society, one of the books, I've got an account of why people, despite a lot of evidence, are refusing to vaccinate their children. And I wanted to have an account of how that goes. And this uses a new diagramming technique that I came up with a couple of years ago, where you represent not just the causal relations, but the emotional relations. So this is called a cognitive affective map, or I call it a value map. And basically, if it's something you like, you put it in a green circle, like a go sign, a traffic light. If there's something you don't like, you put it in a red hexagon. And then you can see how the overall emotional situation is going to support some things or others. So I've looked at the people who are against vaccines. Well, it's because they seem as connected with pharmacy companies, things they don't like. They're afraid of side effects, such as their children getting autism, dangerous chemicals they have, various diseases that will come about. And they're not that keen on scientific research usually because they don't know much about it. And they go by personal experiences and alternative treatments for things like autism. So this gives you an idea of how it can be emotionally coherent to be opposed to vaccines. So this really goes against the explanatory coherence. But explanatory coherence explains very well why the vast majority of scientists and medical people say that vaccines are really beneficial for people. But if you want to explain why there's a minority of people, in the US especially, it's quite a substantial minority, people who don't get their children vaccinated. I think this kind of emotional coherence that I've represented by a different aspect of coherence captured in this kind of emotional map is a better way to go. So there's different ways of explaining things. I think I'm going to skip over social mechanisms. So as a commercial, let me tell you about books coming out in the fall. They actually don't have any of this new work, because this is written before the mental health and the epidemiology, but there's loads of other examples in it. Brain Mind is a general account of cognition and emotion. Mind Society extends that to social groups, both across the social sciences, from social psychology right through to anthropology, and also to 5 professions, including medicine and education and engineering. And then the third book is the philosophical one, where it provides a comprehensive account of the major areas of philosophy, epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, and aesthetics, all from the perspective of mechanisms of mind and social mechanisms, which I've been talking about today. So let me wrap it all up. Conclusions. Philosophy of science doesn't have to be just descriptive or just analytical. It can actually be explanatory. It can explain why scientists do what they do, why they come up with discoveries, how they come up with discoveries, why they worry about evaluation of different hypotheses. It can do it not by abstract social logical analysis, by looking at what's going on in their minds and what's going on in the interactions of scientists. I skipped over the social side, but basically the social mechanisms are the way in which scientists communicate each other. It's not just by words, like in papers, it's also by images. It's also by emotions. So if somebody's in front of a bunch of other scientists and they're really enthusiastic what they're doing, they're using non-verbal communication as well. Okay, so mechanisms are a big part of giving explanations in the philosophy of science. Computer modeling is a really useful part of this, because if you've got ideas about computer models, it actually helps you to build the hypotheses about the mechanisms. But it also allows you to evaluate them, to test them, because you built a computer program and you see whether it behaves the way you expect it to. Sometimes it doesn't, which is a sign that, in fact, you don't have a good mechanistic explanation. Finally, and much more specifically, not universally, there's lots of mechanisms relevant to scientific thinking, but for some really important cases of scientific medical reasoning, such as mental health assessment and also the epidemiological reasoning, explanatory coherence theory, coming out of philosophy but turned computational, provides a really good mechanistic explanation of how it is that people are evaluating competing hypotheses and what causes what. What you get then is, I guess it's still computational philosophy of science, as in my old book, but it's using new ideas to try to extend the explanatory scope of the philosophy of science. Thank you.
Yo creo que van a poder salir más preguntas. Let me switch to English. So I already saw that there's at least 4 people who have questions. Raise your hand in case you have some other questions. So it's Fernanda Stefano. Please, Fernanda.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure since 2 days to have all these questions in my mind, so now I'm starting to do it. Okay, so you talk about alternative hypotheses, and I'm wondering how you deal with alternative incoherent explanations. For example, in 2 levels, and this in 2 levels. One level would be that some population has a problem, a health problem, and you have an explanation from the ancient Chinese medicine and the other one from the Occidental one. Would you allow to combine these 2 explanations in the same diagram, or you keep them separated, and how you deal with it, incoherence over there? That would be one level. And the other level is incoherence in values and goals. For example, one doctor saying that it's better to keep the patient alive even though it has to be with one machine, and the other one said like, no, just quality is more important. So how do you deal with incoherence?
Okay, those are two really important questions. The first question, yes, you want one the same diagram. And so this comes up a lot with alternative treatments, so traditional Chinese medicine being one. One of the sad things about contemporary medicine is it can't treat everything. There are diseases that are chronic and there aren't good treatments for them. So naturally people look to other things. And sometimes it's benign, but sometimes it's dangerous too. There have been cases in Canada recently where people don't give their infants antibiotics because the naturopath says, oh, we can treat that with homeopathy. Or you could do so, but the best way to do that is to build an overall network where you look at what is the evidence for the hypothesis coming from the alternative treatment and see how it competes. So it should be one big network where the account of the disease is different and you then do the same competition. We have different hypotheses coming from the different traditions and then they compete. One of the things that's relevant there is how much evidence there is for those particular things, but also it's important, the question of mechanism. So one of the problems with traditional Chinese medicine is the mechanisms are all wrong. It's all the diseases are balance problems, just like the old humoral theory of disease. It's your qi is out of balance, your yin and yang are out of balance. There's no evidence for any of that. So the mechanisms assumed by traditional Chinese medicine have no support, whereas Western medicine has got loads of layers of things where you can understand causes of causes of causes because the biology has advanced so much. So to answer your first question, what you want to do is use explanatory coherence and do your assessment. If you want to consider the alternative hypotheses, fine. But in every case I know of, the Western medicine, traditional Western medicine is going to do better than these alternative accounts. But then the second question is really interesting, which is, well, what about treatment? What kind of inference does there? So here I talked about explanatory coherence for diagnosis, but that says nothing about treatment at all. And for that really becomes a different kind of inference altogether. I call it inference to the best plan. So when you have a hypothesis, you're making an inference to the best explanation. But for practical inference, it's inference to the best plan. I've got a couple of papers where I describe that as also a coherence process, but it's a different coherence process. So in that case, you've got a number of different actions, a number of different treatments, and a number of different goals. And you want to apply the causal knowledge because the positive constraints between the actions and the goals, it's the idea of this action will accomplish this goal. And that depends on the causal knowledge that you get from the explanatory coherence. But basically it then becomes which action, which treatment most accomplishes my goals. And the goals there aren't the general epistemic ones, they're the practical goals facing the patient in the health circumstances. So if you want to give a very different treatment to someone who's, say, 40 years old versus somebody who's 90 years old, because you may be willing to take risks to keep the 40-year-old where it makes no sense with the 90-year-old. So it's inference to the best plan, what I've called deliberative coherence, where you bring in values and goals and actions to come up with a decision of what to do. One thing I want to work on, I just really became aware of this problem at the Toronto conference I mentioned, is how you actually take the medical knowledge and apply it in particular cases. If it's all statistical, I think you're stuck, because just statistical information applied to an individual, that's an unsolved problem. But if you can take the medical knowledge, turn it into, excuse me, turn it into causal relations and use those causal relations to figure out what's the relation between different actions and different goals, then you have a chance of giving a best plan. But it's going to depend on the values of the patient and the health system too.
Okay, thank you. Let me move to the second of the 5 that we already have. So, Stefano, please.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I'm not an expert in philosophy of science, but I know this paper by Norton Wise, 2011 paper on narrative explanations that you mentioned at a certain point. And my question is, so narrative explanations have to do with the development of an initial scenario to an evolutionary history, and this development is highly dependent on contingent events and the context. And basically, this model of explanation is opposed to the Hempelian model, where we have a general law that allows you to derive the final state of the system from the initial conditions, and it has to do with causation more as a condition of a possibility rather than a determining condition. And Wise says also that explanations have to be empirically adequate and coherent. And by coherence, means the continuity provided by the evolving series of states. And it seems to me that this model was applicable to many things that you that you said about cognitive science explanations, and also about the case of the psychiatrist or the psychotherapist, because the psychiatrist often has to identify the story of how the person became depressed, for example. So what you call the stressors and the triggers, and this is very important, well, for the diagnosis and for the treatment. So my question is your model of explanation opposed to the narrative model of explanation? And if yes, what is the difference?
It's not opposed to it, but I think it's better in some ways. I don't know the Norton Wise paper you mentioned. If you could give me a reference, I'd be grateful. I'd like to look at that. So in one of these books, I guess it's the third one, Natural Philosophy, I compare 3 ways of explaining things. I was also in the second book, narrative explanations, deductive explanations, and mechanistic explanations. And so the narrative explanations have often been used in history, where you tell a kind of story, and we use it in talking to each other as well. The problem with narrative explanations is, how do you evaluate the story? What makes one story better than others? And it sounds like Norton Wise has come up with some of the answers to that. But you also, so I prefer mechanistic explanations. But the advantage of the narrative part is you get something like a historical development, which you could have in cosmology or evolutionary biology. So the question is, how can you merge the narrative part and the mechanistic part? So I actually talk a bit about having narrative mechanistic explanations. So I think the way to get around the problem that one story seems to be as good as another is to use the mechanisms for which you have independent evidence and use that to base your story. The way that can be done in history, say political history, is to use cognitive mechanisms, stuff that comes from psychology and neuroscience, to explain the thinking that's being done by the politician or by the soldiers who are in that. So I think that history could be done a lot better if you bring mechanisms in. The same way that evolutionary history is way better if you don't just make up a story the way that lots of, say, evolutionary psychologists do, but you could actually tie it in with observed facts and tie it in with known mechanisms to do that. So I don't think there's an incompatibility, but I think narrative explanation gets a much better when you merge it with mechanistic explanation.
Okay, what is the book you mentioned?
Oh, it hasn't come out yet. It's out in the fall. Yeah.
So let me turn to the next question. It's by Vincenzo.
Okay. I've actually got 2 questions.
Could you make one, and then after Maria, who's the 5th, will she?
Okay.
Thank you.
Which one? Okay.
Start with the easy one.
Yes.
No, they're both very difficult. Okay, one which is a little bit of a follow-up of Fernando's questions. Actually, my 2 questions are kind of similar to the questions which have been already asked. But so you speak a lot about explanatory coherence, and you also use a little bit the vocabulary of the inferentialist to the best explanation. So the problem here is how to understand coherence to begin with. So in my mind, explanatory coherence is like there are 2 types of explanatory coherence. So the first one, of course, has to be internal. So an explanation must be internally coherent. All the passages of the causal history or the causal mechanism that you try to explain must fit with one another. But then there is also a sort of external coherence, and this is something which is very precious to the heart of the inferentialist, to the best explanation. That is that the explanation must be coherent with our accepted background knowledge. The problem is that sometimes the best explanation actually transgress our accepted background knowledge in the case, for instance, of radical scientific change in this case. And we also live in a world in which we are all invited to think outside the box, and sometimes thinking outside the box actually pays off. So is the inference to the best explanation totally reducible to explanatory coherence, or sometimes explanatory coherence is not a good indicator of what it is actually the best explanation?
I think it always is the best way of doing inference, the best explanation. I don't know any cases where you would do inference, the best explanation that couldn't be captured by this model, because I've applied it to so many different cases. But you're pointing to a number of difficult problems. One problem is with coherence theories of truth. I believe in coherence theories of knowledge, but not coherence theories of truth, is that you can have different coherent approaches that don't correspond to reality. So how do you get the connection with reality? How do you get something external? This is where my principle of data priority is really important. So you don't treat all the elements in the explanatory coherence as equal. You do that if you were Hegelian and you think it's all a matter of thought. But I don't think it's all a matter of thought. I believe in a correspondence theory of truth, and you want to get at the world as it is, independent of our thinking. But the bridge to do that is through the data priority principle, which gives not guarantees, but a certain priority to the results of observation and experiment. Observation and experiment involve interaction with the world. If you just do it by observation, your eyes are getting light that's reflected off something, and that's a connection. You get even better connections if you do experiments, if you have instruments that allow you to intervene systematically in the world, with your telescopes or things that actually change the world. And so you've got ways of interacting with the world, and that gets a priority in the explanatory coherence system. So that's not a guarantee you got the world right, but it's going to be way better than just simply spinning a story in itself. So if you have that as part of explanatory coherence, not a pure coherence system, but a mixed one that involves the interaction with the world, then I think that does make this the best account of inference to the best explanation.
Let me move to Axel, and we'll hold your second question. Axel.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very puzzled about exactly what is it that you're trying to accomplish, because what you're saying is that you're trying to explain empirical findings, right? But the focus of your work is inference, right? You're interested in this kind of inference. So the question is, what does it mean to explain in inference, especially if you're looking at inference as empirical facts? So the idea is that you're trying to explain how decisions infer. And does that have some normative burden? Because when philosophers approach inference, commonly we are logicians or argumentation theories or things like that, or critical thinking people, we always have this, very normative thing at the front, at the forefront. So if I, as a logician, want to work engage with your work, I would like to know whether we are in the same.
Sure, good. So I'm trying to be descriptive and normative. So
how do you?
Yeah, so the descriptive part, I'm trying to explain how medical professionals think. So how do psychotherapists think? How do epidemiologists think? Or how do family physicians think? So that, because they're obviously thinking a lot, they're making recommendations. And the hypothesis is they're thinking by making a kind of inference, because they're obviously going from one set of beliefs to another, so it's inference. What kind of inference is it? Well, I think in all these cases, it's an inference to the best explanation, but how does that work? That's a slogan, it's not a mechanism. Here, with explanatory coherence, I give a mechanism by which these people in all these different fields are doing a very important kind of inference. So that's the descriptive part. Okay, good. Now, I'm interested in the normative part as well, because I want people to do this well. And there are lots of cases where they do it badly. the people who are against vaccinations are also doing an inference of the best explanation, but they're doing it badly. So I want to explain ways in which people do things badly. One, in the vaccination case, is they let their emotional motivations swamp the evidence. Climate change is another example. In my book, The Cognitive Science of Science, I talk about how explanatory coherence supports the idea that global warming indicates climate change, which is caused by human activity. But of course, the American leadership, the current leadership, says that's not right. We don't believe in climate change. It's not humans, it's just nothing. Why do they believe that? It's motivated inference. They're just like anti-vaxxers. They believe their motivations are to make lots of money for the oil companies and to keep the government from intervening. So I've got an alternative explanation of how they're doing it wrong. There's simpler cases where you don't have to bring in emotions. One of the mistakes that people make all the time in inference to the best explanation, which is true in everyday life as well as in science, is that they don't consider alternative hypotheses. That is, you got one hypothesis and you just go with it. But from the point of view of any normative model of inference to the best explanation, it's got to be the best explanation, which requires you to look at the alternatives. Detectives, for example, are notorious for getting one idea of who committed a crime, and then they take that one suspect, and all the evidence they then collect is to support that hypothesis. That's a failure of inference to the best explanation because they're not considering alternative hypotheses. So explanatory coherence gives you loads of ways of criticizing people for making bad inferences. Another thing that's really elementary here that people fail to do is they don't look at all the evidence. They just look at the evidence that supports their own view. But inference to the best explanation along the ways of explanatory coherence says consider all the relevant evidence, consider all the alternative hypotheses, but then quite efficiently you can throw it into the algorithm and come up with a good inference. So it's both descriptive and normative.
Okay, Maria?
Thank you for your talk. My question is related to your answer to Fernanda's question when she asked about the Chinese medicine as an alternative to our Western medicine. And then you replied that a way to evaluate the potential of Chinese medicine as an alternative would be identified if looking at the mechanisms that it provides. And so I was wondering if your theory as a theory of causal reasoning theory privileges, requires, or assumes any causal theory that also requires coherence. Because if so, I have the impression that if you privilege mechanisms, then you cannot explain some reasoning that took place in areas of knowledge that were very young, as you mentioned. At the beginning of this scientific discovery of certain areas, they don't identify mechanisms, but they identify other things, such as dispositions, for instance. And then they have a dispositional theory of causation. And also, we have a lot of examples coming from the pluralistic literature of causality that would not be explained if just assuming one theory of causation. So I was wondering that.
Yeah, it's really complicated because there are lots of cases in medicine where you get good treatments before you have mechanisms. Aspirin's a great example of that. Aspirin was used as treatment for hundreds of years where people get before any understanding. Of course, now we've got a mechanistic explanation of it, but that wasn't a reason not to do it. But here, if you've got a competition going on, if you've got one way of treatment, one theory of disease that you're comparing with another theory of disease, and one of them has mechanisms and the other doesn't, well, the mechanisms one is probably going to win out. But you're right that there are cases where the science is simply too new for the mechanisms to be understood. Actually, psychiatry is like that in a lot of the cases. So the sorts of therapies that my friend Lorette does is often very effective, but she knows some of the mechanisms, but not the whole story. But why do you do that? Well, because there isn't anything better. I don't think that giving Chinese herbs is going to make people better. Homeopathy isn't. Why am I skeptical? Well, both because there isn't that much support for it, evidentially, but the mechanisms just are incompatible with lots of other mechanisms we know about. But take homeopathy, for example. That can make people feel better because it's placebo effects. It makes people think, oh, I'm going to feel better. And the mind, the brain,
interacts with the body in lots of ways. And when people think they're going to get better, they do get better. But it's not because the homeopathy does anything. The whole principle of homeopathy is you dilute things down to such an extreme extent that they couldn't possibly have any causal effect. And so I think on mechanism grounds, homeopathy gets ruled out as well, when a lot about the medicine of the biology is actually known.
Can I?
No.
No?
We have 3 more questions. The second round, but let me ask a question. Otherwise, well, first of all, it's related to one of your open questions, whether assessment and medical diagnosis were similar. This is something I have seen in several specializations of medicine. In neurology, for example, that the diagnosis usually takes longer, but is more precise. But in mental health, my impression, and this is my question to you, is that the assessment or diagnosis and treatment are very much linked together. For example, borderline cases of schizophrenia sometimes are diagnosed after the treatment. Only if the patient responds well to the medication, then perhaps that hallucinations go away, then they can be, they say, certain that it indeed or he or she has schizophrenia. So that's one case, and the general question is, to what extent in your model you could take account of diagnosis or assessment and treatment at the same time or in the same diagrams?
Okay, that's really good. I didn't talk enough about the interactions of diagnosis and treatment. I had a really interesting conversation after my talk with the idea that in all of these cases, the assessment has to be dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got it's not just what you do in the one meeting, you're gonna have subsequent meetings and follow-ups. And one of the things you do, just as you said, is you see whether the medication works. But the same thing is true in medicine too, not just in mental health. So the doctor thinks, well, maybe you've got strep throat, but haven't had time yet to do the swab, you're not sure. So you give them antibiotics, if it works, then it's probably right. My last PhD student was a kidney specialist. And he wanted to do philosophy of medicine, and he had 100 publications on kidneys. He worked in a kidney, and he worked with transplant patients. So his thesis is on the philosophy of transplantation. But he was a great source of it. So when I realized that this interactions between treatment and diagnosis go on in mental health, I asked him, well, does that happen in your field too? And I can't remember his examples, but he says, oh yeah, all the time. Because you're not sure, because it's complicated, you're not quite sure what's going on, but you try out a drug to see if it works, which then confirms your hypothesis. So this is no difference. So I think in regular medicine, just like mental health, you've got this interaction going on as you're changed dynamically your views of what's explanatory coherence, as partly by new evidence coming in, but also whether you see whether the treatment works. So I don't think that's a big difference.
Okay, thank you. Vincenzo, your second question, short.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, my question has been already answered because it was very similar to Axel's question. Like in your final slides, you speak about philosophy of science as being not only descriptive, but also explanatory. And then I wondered whether your philosophy of science can also be prescriptive or even heuristic. And probably my idea for a heuristic value of what you have in mind, but again, I think you've already answered to this question, is whether the idea of explanatory coherence can be used not only for explanation, but also for prediction, those restoring the ancient symmetry between explanation and prediction. But you mentioned the inference to the best plan. If you want to say more about that, otherwise we wait for your book to be out.
Well, no, actually, the one thing that you mentioned now that we haven't talked about is the relation between explanation and prediction. Yeah. Because one of the strengths of the deductive nomological view of explanation was it said, oh, we get both, because it's just deduction in both cases. And in physics, sometimes it works that way, but lots of times it doesn't. So I think it's actually a strength of the mechanistic model of explanation that explains why, if you're doing social science or psychology or medicine or lots of areas of biology, you don't get very good predictions because the mechanisms are really complicated. The parts are interacting in so many different ways, and there's so many other causal factors that you don't get predictions. But you do get explanations because you get a systematic way of figuring out causally where you got to. So I guess getting prediction as well is really nice because it's practically very useful, but it's also very helpful to get an understanding, an explanation of why something
more
happened.
than prediction per se, I was thinking about intervention, to echo what Nancy Cartwright usually says in her work, like we hunt causes in order to use them, in order to apply our causal knowledge to then intervene in the world. And then intervention or plan can be seen as guided by some sort of prediction. If I do this and that, I will get this result out. It's not like we intervene in the world without any previous knowledge and just without predicting a little bit the result. So I think that causal explanations cannot give a full predictions, but they are used to predict the outcome of our intervention in the world. Otherwise, we are left without any guide to implement our knowledge.
But the predictions then are probabilistic. So in the hypothetical deductive account, in the deductive nomological, the predictions are deductive. I know what's going on.
The explanation.
Which is a nice ideal, but even in physics it doesn't work because you've always got lots of different causal factors. You've got a complex system. You get mechanistic explanation, but you don't get prediction because it's chaotic and very slight changes in the initial conditions will lead it. So what you get here is, of course, predictions in the probabilistic sense. So the doctor is thinking, well, it seems to the best of my knowledge that this is your problem and there's a good chance that this treatment will work. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong, not because they're incompetent, but just because the causality is so complicated. So if by prediction you just mean something that's going to be more likely than not, you get that.
Okay.
Rather than
more as a heuristic.
But it's not like predicting eclipses of the sun where you know for sure that it's going to come about.
Okay, so I will take both second question of Axel, Maria, and after you phrase your very short questions, we will finish with Paul Thagard's answers to your questions.
Okay, so then I just want to reaffirm your answer is that for both the descriptive and for the prescriptive questions, the answer is just coherence, right? How the physicians infer by trying to maximize coherence with these constraints, how we should infer by maximizing coherence with these constraints. So that's why you can do both things at the same time because the answer is the same.
Good. Yeah.
Maria, very brief.
Yes. So I have in mind few examples that the pluralists would say that doesn't privilege mechanistic causation relations. And so even though they have identified, sometimes doctors or scientists have identified somehow mechanisms that cause the effects, they also privilege other type of causal explanations such as probabilistic or the other one? Dispositional ones. And so, once again, I was wondering if your theory of causal inference was assuming any of those causal theories.
So what are the alternatives? Dispositional, and what's the other one?
Like the pluralistic ones that say that sometimes scientists privilege one over the others, or it depends on context.
Yeah. Well, there's other, of course, ones that are mystical. Old theories of religion were religious. If you go back not that far, people explain disease in terms of demonic possession. Yeah. So I definitely wanted to privilege causal explanation over demonic possession because I don't think there are demons that possess us. So that's definitely a bias, but it's a bias based on lots of evidence because you can get cures much more effectively by giving somebody psychotherapy than by giving them an exorcism. But the other one you mentioned, though, was dispositions. So the question is, what are dispositions? I learned from the philosopher of science Mario Bunge to think of dispositions as resulting from underlying causal mechanisms. So if you say that salt has a disposition to dissolve in water, why is that? Well, it's because there's a mechanism that's operating. So the only notion of disposition I know that makes any sense is to say dispositions happen because there are underlying causal mechanisms. So that's not an alternative. That's completely compatible, unless you've got some other notion of disposition that I don't understand.
Okay, well, let's thank Paul Thagard again for his